Just checking I'm audible.
Yep.
Amazing. Three, two, one. First, let's talk about what like the setup here looks like, right? All elections on our side of the house are on one day. The key is still that there are different elections. There's still a national, regional, and local elections, but they all happen on the same day. That is, I go into the voting booth with three different like pieces of paper where like mark my cross. I have three different ballots, one for each of the elections, which means I can still vote for different parties. I can still vote for different candidates if I want to. It isn't one election, but they're all happening simultaneously, which means I don't have to, over like the 4 year period or so in which like elections happen, I don't have to go like multiple times to go and like vote in the polling booth. Then let's talk about a couple of things that are likely symmetric here, right? I think regional issues and like local, especially also local issues, are probably going to get a low amount of like attention on either side of the house. This is because just simply nobody cares, right? They're not seen as super important by voters. Voters don't really know what your local government does, right? Gut check this panel. You don't know exactly which things your local government does. You just know that your national government is important. These are the people you see on the evening news. This is the second thing here, right? People follow national coverage mostly. This is because of economics of scale in media things. A media outlet that produces national news stories can have like 10 million read a single article that was written by one person, versus a regional one has like a maximum readership of maybe 1 million people. This means that like the national media can just like attract far more media, people get far more advertising revenue, get far more subscription revenue, all with the same amount of like reporter resources. This just means that they can make prescription this means that they can make subscription cost less. This means that they can this means that they can like pay reporters more, get the best reporters, right? So the national media is the media that is likely going to be best, that most people are going to follow simply because they can and it gets the most national attention, right? Even if they happen at different times, regional issues also often like regional elections also often get turned into like a national referendum, right? This is simply because more media focus on national issues. Therefore, even if I am a voter in like a separate regional election that happens on a different day, I still know most what is happening on a national policy level. And since often like similar parties campaign in all of the elections, that is the German Social Democrats they campaign both on a local, regional, and national level. I am also likely to translate national policy things that happen from one party onto like project those onto the regional parties as well. Therefore, also because often national politicians campaign in these regional elections, they call it in simply because they are far like larger celebrities, far more people know them because they follow national coverage much more. Therefore, therefore, more people are likely to attend rallies, etc., get more attention, right? I think but this also means that they are much far more likely to talk about national elections. Therefore, regional elections get turned to tiny like national policy referenda on no side of the house. I think can be claimed to have a large amount of like attention on regional issues. Why then is our side better? Two arguments you're getting. The second will be extended by Darin in second speech. Firstly, on better policies, elections influence politicians' incentives, even if not on even if they don't happen on their level. A regional election still influences national politicians for three reasons. They want to seem successful. That is, if their party loses, then this also gets projected onto them. They seem less successful. Secondly, they want their party and their ideology to succeed, right? I think this is quite intuitive. Thirdly, they also likely have friends from their party that are campaigning on like a regional level. Therefore, they want those friends to succeed. Before I move on, I'll take the POI for more.
Even if media has a predisposition to national issues, if only local elections are happening at the moment, you have to be charitable and accept they'll probably cover local issues.
Why would they, right? Like local and a local election only gets covered by your local city's media simply because a national media can't delegate a journalist towards talking about this person if only a fraction of their readership actually cares about what is happening in this one tiny little province. I don't care what happens in the north of Germany. I don't live there. I don't really give a fuck, right? Nobody really cares. I think at that point, the national media cannot delegate journalists, but I'm also not going to like keep changing paying my subscriptions the entire time, whether there's a national or local election, simply because that's too much effort for me as a voter. Why then does having all on one day create better incentives? This creates more long-term incentives. Germany, for instance, has 16 states, which means on average, every quarter year, the national government faces an election in one of the states. This means that it's really difficult to do long-term things because reforms are often necessary, right? If you have a bad economy, for instance, you need to do cutbacks. Sometimes you need to raise taxes on the rich. All of these things tend to be unpopular with a lot of voters, and the national governments don't want to anger these people, right? Politicians are and politicians are far more afraid of angering people if an election is coming up, and they might lose some of their voters due to necessary reforms that they are doing. This is really bad because they cannot do necessary reforms simply because they are too scared of them and they have like incentives not to do them, right? Especially since reform benefits often lag behind the obvious negative things. That is, if the government does welfare cutbacks to get more people into jobs, this might create more jobs in the long run, but short term, the only thing people see are these welfare cutbacks because it takes companies a while to hire workers, they need to find workers, etc., which is often why like the positive results of a reform lag behind. Secondly, on regional bias, if there's an election coming up in one state, this makes the politicians skew towards it because they want to win that regional election. This means that there's a national policy that gets biased towards one state. Even if every single state in turn gets biased, different sectors get biased. This means that the environmental policy might be biased towards one state because at the time at which it was being written, there was an upcoming election in that state, and politicians wanted to favor it and gain a lot of voters there, whereas welfare policy might be biased to another state. This is to the detriment of everybody else. This makes general policies worse because they're not evenly balanced and not like creating like there to maximize the utility for all of the voters. Lastly, politicians get distracted because national politicians often get called into to campaign in the regional places simply because I've already told you about how they are far more famous, far more celebrity. This detracts from their ability to just to focus on laws on national policy, which means in the end we get better policy. But we also have higher voter participation, and Darin is going to expand on this. Because voters don't see regional elections as important. I've already told you how there's like far less news attention, and they don't read the kind of news that covers it. Which means there's less coverage because national media doesn't focus on it. This means that if it all happens on one day, it's really, really easy to vote in my regional election simply because I get all of the ballots at once and it's just one extra cross rather than queuing in a polling booth for hours at a time. This is especially important at the point at which a lot of elections happen on weekdays. This looks like in the US where elections always happen on a Tuesday. This means I have to take time off of work to go and queue for hours at a polling booth. But even if that happens on a weekend, who really wants to spend time like hours and hours in a queue? I rest my case.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Now call upon the leader of opposition. You're here.
Oh, hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Okay. I'll take POIs through chat. You can also just turn on your cam if that's what you prefer, but either is fine. I'll start on my next word. There's a reason why elections in the vast majority of the world are staggered. This is in order to protect against the logistical nightmare that voters inevitably will have to face choosing between hundreds of candidates across different positions and the checks and balances necessary to keep the incumbent in check and represent the voice of people when they're dissatisfied. The only thing I'll do in setup is to explain what our counterfactual is and what we'll defend. We will defend a staggered election system where not all officials enter into their terms coterminous. It looks like subnational elections happening at different times, which is nuanced to the needs of their countries, which I want to note is one, well chosen because of a variety of incentives to do these things, but two, is what the country needs based on these assessments. But secondly, it looks like the president and the subnational level coming into power at different times, that just means a different form of you being able to come into power at different periods of time. First argument. Why is this a logistical nightmare and just terrible for the election system and the ways in which we appreciate different types of politicians? Firstly, what is the importance of this? There's a reason why staggered happens, and that's because of the massive resources needed to ensure, one, the integrity of voting, and two, that political information is well accessible to the vast majority of voters. Because they can't just contend that voting happens on a single weekday. It happens for months. Oftentimes, people have to skew through different types of information, misinformation, different types of propaganda in order to come to the best decision for what politician they want to put in power. We understand that there's limited, one, attention spans for people, but also limited political space for people to understand all of these moving parts, and therefore it's an immense burden cost. I said, chat. What is the mechanism? Firstly, it is the immense cost of campaigning that skyrockets. I want to note, it's not just other candidates in the same race, but other race that you have to care against. You are senatorial position running against the presidential race. And in the event that you want to have even more credence for your own political race, like they explained, there's an incentive to do so. Very clearly, you would have to do things like make a perverse incentive where richer candidates will try and do things like have more screen time to block out smaller candidates, to block out smaller races, and remove the credence that these things are given. And I want to note, they say this would exist on either side. It's a difference in extent. It's untrue that it's important. It looks like mayors on our world that are given more credence, who are important because often they're the ones who give out things like land titles. They're the ones who give out and are able to do direct investments in social services within the region and within the area. In the world, it looks like the Democratic Party being able to invest in Bernie Sanders at the same time as investing in Obama after the elections because they don't have to run at the same time. It looks like on their world, the most impactful races are given priority, which if they believe local elections themselves are important to some extent, this is just terrible. The impact of this is clear. Maybe it's diversification that they want on their side. Clearly, it is immensely harder for smaller politicians to outcompete and campaign properly. Second, it is harder to push for checks and balances, i.e., the reality of the world right now is when one candidate's fate is decided by one election, no one will want a recount. And that's because every vote will have to be recounted for every single position, which itself interferes with the own integrity of the people who want to recount. And so in instances when you think that there's political things like political vote buying or whatnot, or even things like corruption within votes, it's far harder for you to hold these things accountable. Compare this to local elections that happen at a different time. It's far easier for you to call these things into account because it's not counting the president's votes and the vice president's votes and recounting all of these things, only the local election and a few number of people that you have to recount in order to ensure that it was safe and it was integral. 3, that turnover is insanely hard. And this responds to the reform argument that comes from their first speaker. Like, imagine this intuitively. You have a new Senate and a Congress that enter into their positions completely from scratch. No one is aware of legislation. No one is aware of the bills that were being passed. What this leads to is so much intense gridlock from the initial friction of trying to scramble and find the documents that were needed in the transition in the first place. Imagine if all congressmen who came into power were completely new. That's why staggering is important. You need things like seniority. You need things like the transition of knowledge through several terms to ensure that people are able to, 1, overcome this initial barrier of gridlock, but 2, actually enact important policies. What this argument does is explain to you why even if they have the best politicians, that insane amount of gridlock in the interim makes it difficult for them to enact actual long-term policy within their terms. What is the weighing of this? This is importantly irrespective of political outcomes. What you can believe is that legislation is far harder to pass. It is less expensive to run well elections, but also for other politicians to enter into the race. But also, there's less perverse incentives to undercut other electoral races, which they might assert is unimportant for individuals, but it's oftentimes more important, especially with the frequency and the necessary closeness of these people towards them. Second argument. One nation, one election introduces perverse incentives and worsens the electoral process. Before that, POI, sure.
If, as you say, voting is a months-long process, how willing are voters to go through this month-long process, not once for the national, but once for the national, regional, and local times, 3 times in 1 year?
Like, it doesn't happen 3 times in 1 year. Oftentimes, it's every 2 years, every 4 years, every 6 years. Clearly, these people don't understand how elections work. And why that's important is because obviously people aren't going to be as politically fatigued from all these things happening at the same time. Very clearly, it's worse under your comparative frame. Why is this argument important? The reason why we have staggered elections is because we want to make sure that politicians make long-term planning and decisions, i.e., they have to care about what happens next and not just the immediate term after they leave and can't run for election after. 3 mechanisms. 1, we'll explain to you that politicians become extremely short-termist, i.e., it is the incentive to use all of their money at the same time. And the reason for this is intuitive. No one will stop you from spending all of their money because everyone is leaving at the same time, especially when individuals themselves don't expect a re-election. They don't. And the comparative on their art side is that it's easy for parties to say, I don't want you to spend all of this budget because I need the money 3 years from now and control fiscal budgets and make sure that spending is more legitimate and more controlled. What this means is it's harder for you to control the fiscal policy that happens within the 6-year term, which oftentimes throws countries into realms of disruption and realms of collapse. Secondly, that's an important check and balance for power. Look at the midterms like in the US. It's a voice for people to express their disapproval or approval of the current admin and force them to be regulated in response. It's why we have the Democratic Congress and Senate after conservatives wins prior. Without this, an admin gets into power, no accountability to change them while their term is ongoing. Clearly, this is terrible in the case that you have extremely bad governments. But three, it's decreased scrutiny for local level elections. It's harder to count things like corruption. It's hard to get things like coverage, which they explain are important, but are oftentimes the ones that break elections, that destroy trust in the electoral process, that are important for people to believe in democracy and even opt into voting in the first place. You only need one bad election to destroy the country, and this is compounded when you allow longer terms to remain unchallenged. Oppose.
Thank the speaker for that speech. Now call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. You're here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Fantastic. Every single hour you spend in a queue waiting to be able to cast your vote is an hour you could have spent working. It is an hour you could have spent ensuring that you're able to put food on the table and put clothes on your children's back. I think this is significantly harder to do when you have to take 4 separate days off in a year to be able to vote in a myriad of different elections. We make this easier. We sum it up into one glorious day where you vote. I think that's easier and it is more convenient. We'll beat them on political fatigue, and then we'll beat them on the impacting on why people voting is important, even if they're less informed on our side of the house. But let's start to look at their first claim. They say that this is logistically hard to do because people aren't likely going to educate themselves on the different political elections, and they're therefore going to make uninformed decisions. Notably, it's assertive why people make uninformed decisions, and it is assertive why we should care about this. 2 reasons why you shouldn't. One, I think even if I don't know a lot about local elections or regional elections, and I know some about national elections or anything, I think at the end of the day, we as human beings, and particularly human beings living in democracies, have political ideology. That is to say, you've grown up in a democracy, you've grown up knowing how the system of voting works, you likely have some sort of political ideology. Whether you're a Christian and that shapes you to make you a more conservative-leaning voter, whether you're a left-wing person because you're a woman or a minority that cares about social justice, you still have a general political camp. You are either right-wing or you are either left-wing. This means that you uniquely probably don't have to mega inform yourself to be able to cast a vote that's productive towards your society. Insofar as you were raised in a democracy, you know what political ideology best suits your needs, you're still able to make a vote that's beneficial to your cause. At least it is comparatively more beneficial than were you to vote to the other side. I think people generally do have enough knowledge to be able to make a somewhat decent decision, probably still better than them not voting at all. Secondly, I think that being a single issue voter is legit. Even if it is true that I learn nothing about my local election and I only look at one election, I think picking one single issue that I think mean a lot to me and then voting based off of that because it is convenient is a totally legitimate way to engage with democracies. I think if you as a woman think that abortion is really, really important and that's why you're not going to vote for Donald J. Trump, I think you using that same logic to apply to your regional elections or to not vote for a Republican mayor within your own state is a total legitimate way of engaging with democracy. I don't see the issue with this. Being an issue voter that focuses on national issues and applies them to regional contexts is still a democracy. It is still a vote. It is still legitimate. We'd rather have it as opposed to you not being able to vote because you cannot go through the inconvenience of standing in long queues. I think this is fine. We beat them on that worst case also. Then they say this is logistically hard. That is to say, you don't know where the votes are going to go. It is hard to count them. One, I think it is easier on our side of the house when it's all jumbled up into one day. On your side of the house, you have to bring employees, you have to bring people to count ballots on multiple separate days across the year, and you have to set up the different things. I think there's just more ways for you to be able to fuck it up. If you don't mess it up in the first one, you might mess it up on the second one, you might mess it up on the third one. There's just more attempts for you to be able to fail. But secondly, why can this not be done? I think uniquely we're able to flip this. At the point at which there's one single election in the year, people likely care more about the logistics of it. That is to say, if I have 3 different elections and one of them turns out to be rigged because we counted the votes wrong, I probably am not going to backlash as hard. Whereas on our side of the house, you have one single day, one election that decides all of it. I think that's the point at which the average person cares about accountability. The average person cares about the votes being legitimate and it being done in a fair and just way. Because people care more, because people have more pushback mechanisms, governments are going to be incentivized to do this better. We flip that point in totality. Now then, in response to Leander's case, Leander explains why politicians are better able to make long-termist decisions that are economically productive, but also generally better. They say no, because we cannot hold these politicians accountable. One, I think that you eventually can. That is to say, I don't understand the urgency. If I see that a politician is making a bad decision, eventually I'll be able to vote them out, right? Eventually there will be another grand election. I don't have to punish them at the regional elections in order to get accountability. But secondly, you're still able to communicate to politicians, right? You're still able to protest. You are in a democracy. I think accountability to some extent still exists. If anything, they only prove a marginal benefit here. Notably, Leander's analysis is far more crisp. We basically explain that you're unable to be long-termist insofar as you'll be ousted from your party if you try to be long-termist. That is to say, if you had a national election are trying to push economic policy that would definitely be more productive 3 years down the line, you're unable to pass it on their side of the house because it means your party will be punished at the regional level, because it means all of your mayors are going to get kicked out and you're going to lose those other minor elections. You aren't able to think long-term. Notably, this means that, one, your own party will punish you for doing so. If you set economic plans that are productive and actually lead to better outcomes for people down the line, getting inflation under control, fixing the housing crisis, notably, all of these are issues that require long-term plans that work in the future. You're unable to do so insofar as it's politically unpopular in the moment which you enact the policy. This means that you'll be punished at the regional elections, you'll be punished at the local elections, and your own party will get rid of you. You're forced to correct instantly. You're not allowed to be long-termist. You aren't able to fix issues that necessarily require long-termist thinking, particularly economic ones. Now then, onto the idea of political fatigue. They say that you're going to be fatigued because it is one large election, therefore it's underwhelming, I guess. Couple of responses. One, let's just clearly break the comparative on political fatigue panel. I want you to understand, like, the process of voting is so draining. It is so annoying. I, in my life, have voted in one election, the European elections in mine. That shit sucked, man. I had to stand in line for like 5 hours to be able to get in. Notably, Denmark is quite developed. We're quite privileged. If it was that bad in this setting, you can only imagine what it's like in like a country in India. I think that this means it is quite uncomfortable process to actually go out and vote. Notably, then, bundling all of it into one day means it is just less of an inconvenience. You're less likely to be fatigued because you go through that horrible experience overall less. Can I take that point, please?
This is such a nonsense frame. If all that mattered was minimizing the number of times people go to the ballots, why not just have elections once every 20 years, once every 50 years?
Because then you can't hold people accountable, right? We still care about accountability. We just don't think it has to happen every single day. Every 4 years is reasonable. Like, come on, every 20 years, like, we're not standing for fucking autocratic regimes. Be real here. That was genuinely nonsensical. Secondly, notably, panel, the most vulnerable actors, that is to say minorities, people who are working class, who cannot afford to take off multiple days to vote, on your side of the house are structurally locked out. They cannot afford to take multiple days off of work, and their bosses do not afford them this privilege in many settings. I think when you have one large day where all of the voting occurs, these people are going to be empowered to be able to vote. Why are these people very, very important? One, because it means that when politicians know that these voters are able to vote, they're unable to ignore them. You have to politically campaign in poorer areas of America. You have to go into Compton, not just Main Street, Los Angeles, where the Hollywood sign is. You have to go into these places because you know these voters are now increasingly capable of voting. They do not have to take off 4 different years across the year to be able to go vote. They're more empowered to do so. You have to then take their opinion into account because they can pose a genuine threat to you. This means that, one, you're more likely to front minority politicians because you know they're going to gain votes. But secondly, you just listen and talk about their opinions and perspectives on different issues more because there's an incentive for you to pander to their vote because they are more likely to vote. Proud to stand on government.
Thank the speaker for that speech. Now call upon the Deputy Leader of Opposition. You're here.
Just chat it, please. So just chat it. I'll take it at some point. All right. Starting in 3, 2, 1. The average voter is not so much concerned about consolidating how many bus trips you take to the local precinct to vote. They are concerned about existential issues that are in their local community that they want more time and more consideration for, but their side collapses all of these things in one downstream, one grand day of violence, one grand day of polarization, one grand day of the biggest existential decision for the past 5 years and next 5 years that might turn out worse for minorities and worse for representation. Firstly, I will talk about the perspective of the average voter. Secondly, I will talk about the perspective of states and governments. First, the perspective of the average voter. Gov says a few things here in terms of the perspective of the voter that are just either nonsensical or just straight up not true. The first thing they say is local issues don't matter to the average person because they just don't matter, that's their only reason, and also that they're not covered by the national media. One, they do matter to a lot of people. Why do they do matter to a lot of people? One, they're the most proximate issues to you. They're more likely to directly affect your workplace if, for example, there's more hiring of these things, more governance and accountability in your local city government that's more able to affect your business or your way of life. Two, local issues matter to you because the politicians there are probably people that you can actually see compared to the people at the national level where likely they're not going to campaign in your local area. Three, local issues matter to you because your city matters to you, your local culture matters to you, and these things affect the things that often are many existential things for you, which is why these things matter. The second thing they say is, well, they don't focus on these things because the CNN is going to focus on national elections all the time. Like, it's not true, right? Like, if there is no local election that's happening, or if there's no national election that's happening, the CNN is going to represent the next most entertaining thing. And that is probably the local election. If it's not happening at the same time, they cannot just say no one will care about these things. This is an absurd reason. Secondly, they say, well, at least you don't spend time as a voter in more elections. One, guys, most of the time, these things are holidays. It's unclear as to why it causes so much opportunity cost for your work. Two, if in the case it does cause opportunity cost in your work, then at minimum, you're more likely to at least think about the elections. Compared to their side of the house where, yes, there's one less bus trip, there's also one less day to think about how you were likely going to vote, or how you space out, for example, your considerations and your interests throughout the year or for multiple years because you're voting on different levels of governance. How does this then harm, given that all of this material is out on their side, how does this then harm the voter? Three things. One, it is harder for you as a voter because it overloads you at once. They literally say it is fatiguing to vote. It is equally and more fatiguing before the vote because, in fact, you have to, as an average voter, who's like you pressed by your job, pressed by your education, pressed by all the pressures of life, to think about your different candidates. The problem on the government side of the house is that they force it all at the same time. What is the harm of this? One, in developing countries where voter education is already sparse, it collapses these things because they have to do all of this campaigning at the same time. But rather, it's very hard for you to do it at all at the same time because different periods of time change in the issues that you're talking about, which is why it's harder for actually educating people. But two, if it's the case that they have to think about these things, and they will think about these things very clearly, they're more likely to think about the national election rather than the local election, and they're more likely to be polarized about that. Therefore, down the ballot, they are less likely to care. It's more likely, in fact, that they're less likely to vote properly on the local election or vote or care about these things at all down the ballot because of the fact that they are pressured and fatigued. Chat, by the way, at the top of the ballot, which is why they're less likely to vote on these things properly or overload them, such that fatigue is probably greater on government. Secondly, it is harder for the voter because, for the reasons I explained earlier, it collapses local or issue-based distinctions that matter to them. This is an important thing. For most people, the local election is what really matters. Often governments are centrist, like literally the other motion the info slide says, or in the set says, centrism. Most governments really don't change a lot of things. We're not the US, right? Often there's very little differences between different parties. The difference is local election, the things that actually affect the way your education, that affect how much budget allocation is given to roads or other things that you prioritize in your local area. These things are often overshadowed by national party mechanisms. The justified coverage that you would likely get under our side gets outshadowed and outcrowded on theirs, which is why the things that you're likely most proximally going to turn out to in the first place would make you feel that you care about elections and democracy to begin with are less likely to be properly represented, which is why turnout often gets less on their side or more disaffected, marginalized people happen on their side rather than ours. Three, and the most important one, it is harder for the voter because they cannot feel that they hold their government accountable. This is what happens. National parties stay in their position for 6 years in the Philippines on their side. There's very little midterm accountability. That's why when they go to this grand day that they're talking about, it's extremely dreadful and extremely anxiety-inducing because you as a party know it's either live or die. You have no way to hold them accountable in the midterm election because it no longer fucking exists. Which is why when you go there, it's probably more likely, one, people are violent because they care more about this one big decision that determines the rest of the state for the next 6 years. Two, people are more likely polarized in your family discussions or other things because they know how big of a decision this is. 3, people are in general less likely to turn out in the first place because they know how big of a decision this is. You cannot just vote on a local election or national election. You have to vote on all of the things at once, which is likely to pressure people and feel as if they cannot hold that state accountable, feel existential about the decision, feel worse about it, and feel less fulfilled. Before I go on, POI.
Yeah, but this is the easiest way ever. What's more important, some people making marginally more informed votes, or some people who otherwise would not be able to vote at all actually voting? Clearly you're weighed out.
Why would they not vote at all? Like, it's probably true for the reasons that you give. They would still vote in different years. In fact, it's more likely that you're not likely to feel you can go out and turn out to the major all-encompassing existential vote because of the fact that you don't think you're a qualified voter because there's so many things that you're not qualified about because you haven't read about these things in the first place. You actually decrease turnout on your side. Secondly then, governance. They lose here. They say logistics, but logistics is a wash at best because note panel, the time is compressed, but the volume is the same, and in fact, worse on their side because it's easier for the state to justify increasing campaigning costs, increasing the amount of people that we take away to staff these places, more security, more spending on, like parties and fiestas and all of that. If you can say it's all the biggest grand day in the world, it's now more expensive compared to our side where it's dispersed, which are more likely to cover for the cost, for example, of these things. 2, the most important issue here is the long term. They say the long term is good. 1, if there's a long-term decision on their side, the party is not likely going to suffer about it in the midterm. It's unlikely going to hurt them. 2, if there are bad decisions that are long-term, they might get it worse on their side because the state, Trump literally is not accountable in the midterm. There's no referendum on his policies and his governance. That is terrible because people cannot explain their dissent. For those reasons, then oppose.
Thank the speaker for that speech. Now call upon the government whip. You're here.
Hello, just confirming that I'm clearly audible and visible.
Yes to both.
Awesome. I won't be checking the chat, so please don't put your POIs there. You can just unmute and ask me a question. Always happy to engage. Before I begin, just would like to say big shout out to everybody here. This has been a really, really fun comp. Thank you to any organizers that might be in here, to the other team, and of course to my wonderful team. You guys are the goats. Not before. I will begin on a self countdown of 3, 2, 1. Panel, the opposition team clearly doesn't like to listen. Let me spell out our case in very simple words so they stop strawman. Simply, on voting, we get better understanding and voting in local election because in the status quo, people don't watch things about the local elections whatsoever. Leander mechanized to you why there is significant competition for media attention at these times because the dominant party in the federal government or the minority parties also want to be represented locally. That's how they campaign for better votes in the future. Why is this different when we have it on one day? Because now your federal politician is running his federal campaign. Your local politician is running his local campaign in a different news outlet that is local. And when you look at this media, it's going to be differentiated because the federal politicians don't have infinite resources to outcompete them continuously, right? Notably, people often can't vote at all because in these local elections because they're very spread out. They don't get time off work. They say, oh, it's just a public holiday. In Germany, they vote 16 to 18 times a year in local elections. I'm not certain that we're getting 18 federal holidays off a year for Munich to be voting in their local elections. That's just not how it works, right? They also quite literally don't see local elections as important because it's viewed as some sort of local power play by Nigel Farage in your area, right? Obviously, then, we also just outweigh this on the fact that getting people to vote is logically prior to them having a better vote. This means that if opposition can't interact with the fact that on their side of the house, people are not showing up to the local booths in the first place because of the reasons we've given in now 3 speeches, then their impacts literally cannot materialize. 2 clashes in this debate. Firstly, better policy. Second, better voting turnout. Extension on minorities that has already been covered, but I'll repeat it. Firstly, on policy. Leander tells you that policy is improved by this, both in the signaling effect that local elections have to governments and in the way that the direct voting influences them. Op says that we need checks and balances. I'll note now that the term of a federal election is symmetrical on both sides. This means when I elect a president in my country, he's in power for 3 years, 5 years, however the term is, on both sides of the house. The way that we check and balance these people then is through things like legislative checks, the judicial branch being able to veto the decisions of the president and stuff. Journalists are able to hold these people into account. On our side, politicians then are not held accountable. They have some legroom to briefly have less popularity and increase it by having better long-term policy instead of having to compete every single month out of the year, because that's what's deemed important by parties. 2 points of weighing for this then. Firstly, this is the tipping point for how you can actually get long-term policy. We create these long-term incentives because these federal governments aren't constantly campaigning in every different region and state. We then get better federal policy in the long term. I'll note that the weighing here, not right now, is very intuitive. When I have a good policy for 3 years, I see these benefits not just in the 2 months before an election, but rather compiled over the time of 3 years. I'm then happier for a much longer period of time. Secondly, on width, I'll note everyone in the country is affected by federal policy. Even if for whatever reason we would buy opposition's argument that, okay, now people are coming to local elections having slightly better votes, I think notably you're just affected much better in federal policy. That means if my government is more efficient over the 4 years instead of in the 2 months before election, I'm just going to be much happier on this regard. Secondly, on voter turnout. Leander tells you how this increases voter turnout as people care most when there are large things at stake. We've already proven then why in the status quo national and state level media are significantly undervalued by voters because of this competition mechanism. Op says people will just find this illegitimate and not show up. I don't understand why, if my voting process is slightly less efficient or takes one very long day, I'm going to overthrow my government. That's the burden they have to push here, that I'm going to destabilize my entire government instead of voting out the party that's already in power. I'll give you a super radical example. Belgium was left without a government for 8 months last year because they had to make coalition discussions after the vote. And they did recover. Belgium still exists. We didn't overthrow Belgium. I don't understand why this is the tipping point in anybody's understanding. 2 weighings here then. Firstly, on positive spillover. At the point that we generate more discussion around voting, let's say your mom is voting, so you go with her. You're going to talk to your friends. Even if this happens in the polarized way that opposition's trying to frame, federal elections are largely polarized as they themselves frame on both sides of the house. This means that just this becomes a bigger event. So you're more incentivized to do things like talk about it. You're more incentivized to go out and learn about it. You also just have more capacity to do this because now this is the one day a year that your government is actually able to give you off for the voting, or even if they're not, you can probably take some holidays out of your year, right? For that one day. Notably, people in the US get 10 days off a year, so they can't do it for every local election. In a second. Secondly, on exclusivity for regional voting, I'll note that we've already proven to you that regional issues don't get saliency in the status quo. This means that we preserve voter turnout and the discussion around it. Opposition agrees that regional issues are important, but I'll note that I don't think all voters understand why they're important. We actually give you the space for these people to be able to investigate this, to be able to look into this, and to be able to participate logically prior to any kind of marginal tipping point on, oh, well, maybe they vote slightly better. I'll take a POA.
Good governments won't get punished in their long-term policy if there are midterms, but bad governments, the most important case, will. And they will be more responsive if they are indeed bad. That is the most important case that you have 6 years of an accountability for.
You can still control bad federal government on both sides of the house. That is how the status quo works. We have a variety of resources that I've already framed to you at the very top of my speech about this. You have different branches. You have journalism. You have impeachment in bad scenarios, right? We tell you that policy gets better over time. Leander's already framed to you why there's better incentives. Finally, on marginalized groups, we tell you that these groups have access issues to elections, right? This looks like quite literally Republicans making less polling booths in Black areas to make voting times longer for these kinds of local elections, right? 3 weighings then on why preserving the minority vote is so important. First, in exclusivity, there's just no viable alternatives existing to get these groups to vote. I can't give everybody 1 day a month off. Secondly, on depth, voting is important to people. These are the groups that are often underrepresented and actually deserve that kind of connection to the government that they're missing in the status quo. And finally, on principle, I think this outweighs all of their claims because making voting more accessible, regardless of how good that voting is just inherently good. Voting is the basis of legitimacy in a state. I give up my right to participate in the state, but I also do that knowing that I will have some sway over the government. Even our absolute worst case of minority vote isn't changing things. Darin proved to you why this isn't happening. You're still signaling the government your interest. You still get to participate to vote, and we are so proud to propose.
Thank the speaker for that speech. Now call upon the opposition whip. Here.
Hello, Nelly. I will take POIs however you want to give them. Philippine midterm elections are tomorrow. I'm going to vote in my home province, which is in the mountains in one of the poorest regions in the Philippines. I expect to be at the polling booth for all of 30 minutes. Now, either Germany and Denmark are more backwards than the most developing of developing states, or a proposition has been grossly exaggerating the costs to the individual of voting. I'm thoroughly convinced it's the latter. 3 issues in this speech. The first thing I want to talk about is where we get fairer and better elections. Government begins with the bizarre assertion that nobody cares about local elections. I want to point out from the get-go that the observation that local elections are underrepresented in media and in voters' minds in status quo is no reason to further sideline them by lumping them in with bigger national elections that by their own concession and by their own proof are going to get the predominant share of attention. If anything, this justifies rescheduling local elections separately to ensure that local issues and platforms are given adequate screen time and voter attention. Moreover, we just reject this premise outright. We think staggered elections, even in countries like the Philippines, do give you incentives to care about smaller races, for 2 reasons we outline down the bench that don't get an adequate response. Firstly, the media coverage they claim that goes to national elections doesn't go away when there's a local election. CNN isn't just going to say, oh, well, there's no national election, so I have no reason to care about the stuff that's happening in the regions. They still want to make money. They still want your attention. They're going to cover these local elections precisely because now you've freed up resources for them to do so. You're going to reassign the reporters to talk about what's happening in the provinces. But secondly, even if it's true that you don't need to be ultra informed about what's going on in local elections, the problem, as we explained from Zen, is the perverse ways lumping all elections together changes the way campaigning happens. Zen explains that when all elections happen on the same day, you're not just campaigning against other people in your race, you're campaigning against other races. So if I'm a mayoral candidate, I have to convince the people in my district that our election matters more, that they should spend disproportionate amounts of their attention on what's happening in our jurisdiction versus the national race. This was bad for 2 reasons we told you that got no response. 1, because it privileged the richest parties and the richest candidates. It's the people who can afford to drown out the small races. It's the people who exist in the capital, who exist in the most powerful regions that will dominate what media outlets say, a problem that you otherwise wouldn't have had if you just scheduled the races at different points in time. But secondly, it's because people feel like they're not informed enough because so much is going on. We explain a nuanced characterization of how voters digest political information. It's not that they become overwhelmed when they have to think about local issues versus national issues. It's that they have a finite attention span at any one given time. So if too much is happening at any one given time, that's the moment where they're likely to opt out of the electoral process because they don't feel adequately equipped to vote on everything. In the comparative, as long as they feel adequately equipped to vote on the national race, they can vote on that day. If they feel like they know enough about the local race, they can vote on that day. The knowledge threshold to feel like you want to go out and vote is lower when elections are distributed, which is why more people turn out to vote in our side. This leads me to the second issue. Let's talk about turnout directly. I want to begin by calling out some of the nonsense claims we kind of hear from Gov. Like, election days are holidays in the vast majority of the world. Maybe the Americans get 10 days of holiday a year. Like, that's a them problem. But furthermore, I don't understand like what work you're missing out on. If this is a norm in the society you live in, people probably understand why you're taking off a day from work. Given that turning out is something that's valorized in most parts of the world, I don't understand why they would punish you greatly for it. Furthermore, I think if anything, we can flip this. The reason polling times take long is because you're voting for more people at the ballot. You make the voting process more efficient when you're voting for fewer positions in any one given election. So you don't have to be at the polling booth all day. It takes 30 minutes because you're filling out 5 names on a ballot versus 50 names on a ballot for every single position in your country. So if it's time at the voting station that's the tipping point for voters to turn out, we actually win by showing that it's lower on net. Thirdly, let's talk about election integrity. What we explained from Zen is that this pools politicians' incentives on GovWorld to oppose recounts because all of the ballots are pooled, and the consequences of a recount could damage their own office. If I am the winning presidential candidate and there's some suspicion of election fraud in a far-off region in my country, I'm going to do everything in my power to make sure a recount doesn't happen because I don't want any challenge to the appearance of the credibility of my vote. That same incentive on the part of politicians doesn't exist when there's a distinction between different races. I'm more than happy to support a recount in that region because my name wasn't in the ballot and it wasn't my election result that was being interfered with. The response we hear from DPM is that voters care more when all of the elections happen on the same day. Firstly, this doesn't work because the argument we gave you wasn't about voters' incentives, it was about politicians' incentives. We explained why politicians will oppose the recount even if voters wanted to. But secondly, the problem is that you're now pitting voters' incentives against each other. If I like the local candidate who won in my region, but there's a suspicious candidate who won in another region, I'm still going to oppose the recount in that region because I don't want the election results in my county to be questioned or to change. This is the problem with lumping things together. Even people with genuine incentives are now incentivized not to question the system whatsoever so that you end up with the same thing. The final thing to respond to under this issue is the minority voting stuff that I think is new material that comes out of GovWhip. I think the issue of people wanting to remove polling stations from minority blocks happens on either side of the house. I'm not sure why Trump wouldn't strip away voting boxes in Black communities if there's just one election. If anything, it makes it easier to spot when there's a midterm election because you notice the trend of voting boxes going down over time, and it's easier to build more polling stations over time. Sorry, your POI is out of time. Let's finally then talk about why this creates terrible political incentives. And I want to note the absolutely stunning lack of response to the material we give down the bench. There are 3 impacts we give you that till now receive no response from them. Firstly, we explained that midterm elections are a vital check and balances that keep administrations from over-accumulating a concentration of power. Their disingenuous response to this is to say that there are other ways you can hold them accountable. You can protest. What are you going to say? Oh, please, Mr. Trump, don't deport me. Please don't send ICE to my home. Clearly, it's about extents. You are far more powerful when you have a vote, and the administration has far more incentive to care about you when you have a vote. Secondly, we explained that having all officials be conterminous is a recipe for fiscal irresponsibility. There's nothing to stop you from spending out the budget when everyone's going to end their term at the same time to no response from them. But thirdly, we explained that this just creates so much gridlock at the beginning of the term. There are no senators who are coming back from the last term. There are no local officials who are ensuring the continuity of local policies being passed. It's a recipe for confusion at the beginning of every electoral cycle. It's worse that nothing gets done than the dream of ideal policy on Gov. For those reasons, opposed.
Thank the speaker for that speech. Call upon opposition reply speaker. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah. I'll start on my next word. Maybe for some parts of the developed world, it's not a big issue. But for many in the developing world, the third world countries under authoritarian rules, under people who don't serve their best interests, it is precisely the frequency of elections that are needed to hold people accountable when you can no longer rely on impeachment, when you can't rely on destroying a government. First response, and just general way. How do we actually make elections fair and ensure accountability? The first thing they say is there's no urgency to actually vote so frequently. The intuition for this is just untrue. Intuitively, think about it. It took Trump a couple of months to make his Liberation Day tariff announcement. And in that time, Canada and Australian polls shifted towards Liberal Party candidates when their oppositions prior were winning. This shows that people's priorities, problems, and satisfaction with the current government changes by the day, already explained by all 3 speakers. This is important because when people's priorities change, we need to give them a voice to ensure that the government right now is ceding to what they want because it's obviously supposed to be representative of what people and the citizens want. The second is that even if it wasn't as urgent, We explain why, for politicians who want to represent minorities, for smaller parties who want a voice, for new changes are just massively weakened under the comparative. Like, this a large election cycle means you compete with other categories of electoral races, which, yes, you do in status quo, try and outcompete other candidates with screen time. But now it's exponentially expanded. You do this for other positions being ran for. You beat out minorities who could only run for mayoral positions of municipal-led races. And this is important because if they want more representation for people, if they want people to turn out to vote, oftentimes it's these parties that are the change between a minority entering to the election in the first place or casting their vote to change the whims of the country. Thirdly, they say that a vote is better, uninformed vote, a vote that exists is just better than an uninformed vote. Firstly, I'm just not sure why, right? There are many reasons why you do care about these things, i.e., you have media coverage, you have things like the proximate needs, and that's why it's just more important for you to care about these things. But secondly, an uninformed vote is just as bad. In fact, worse. We'd explain that it looks like things like allowing local level corruption that came from the first speech in vulnerable communities, but never get shed light on because of the limits in coverage and attention span of voters. It looks like not thinking enough about how the long term matters, which we explain becomes immensely more important when you can't vote in half the Senate of seats to keep your president from running your country to the ground. This is immensely important because elections, like they explain, are crucial in leading the lives of the country for the next 6 years, for the next couple of years, that often don't just permeate for that term, but often permeate for decades into the future. When you're riddled with debt, when you're riddled with high inflationary measures, it's terrible for citizens on the ground. Their alternative that comes from WHIP is to explain, well, we have things like overthrowing the government, where you can impeach their leaders. We will rely on journalists to cover the top secret stories of corruption and either get people to rally and force change or wait 6 more years under the subjugation of an iron hand. Maybe it is a couple of more years. A couple of more years is immensely important for the poor person who needs economic upliftment now, for the poor person who needs social services now that they could never get in that 6-year term that you forced them to sit under. Maybe it's frequent, maybe it's an inconvenience. For the most majority of people who need it, it isn't. Lastly, on the idea of transition, that gets little to no response from their side. It is, again, even if you had the best politicians, we explain why it doesn't matter. It's immense gridlock in the transitionary period. Transitioning issues with how you actually do things like give people documents to transition or understand what bills and legislation are priorities now. Fiscal discontinuity, because people don't understand whether or not budget should be taken for the long term or the short term. We explain why it's more short-termist under their side, which explains all the reasons why you destroy a country for years when it's stuck in inertia, when you can't hold them accountable, when the country itself doesn't know how to run it. The moment 6 years change, everyone in status quo.
I thank the speaker for that speech. Call upon the government reply speaker to close the debate. Here.
Am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Amazing. 2 things in this speech. Firstly, participation versus regional and local issue attention. Secondly, policy incentives versus accountability. On the first clash, even if voters have more information on regional elections, this does not matter because often the issues and ideologies are similar between national and regional elections. If I like the National Social Democrats, I also likely like the regional ones because they have the same ideology. They likely stand up for me as a poor voter. Additional information, therefore, isn't a large representation benefit. Representation, though, is contingent upon participation. Alisa already explains to you no response from both op speeches after her, right? Even if on government I know about regional elections, this doesn't mean I actually have the time to vote. And the time does take longer. This is, by the way, new from UpWhip, but it still takes longer on opposition because what really takes long is to check the ID, to walk in and out of the polling booth. Doing 3 crosses instead of 1 takes 2 seconds longer. But checking every single voter's ID once every single year on every single election, that takes really, really long. Waiting times are going to be the same, right? But also fatigue before the vote happens 3 times in the ideal op world because I care about national elections, then I got bombarded by months of regional coverage, then by months of local coverage. This happens again and again and again. Even if there's a holiday, it still takes hours for me to vote, which is hours that the single mom who doesn't work 2 jobs doesn't have with her kids that she cannot spend that weekend, right? Also, just empirically, the US votes on Tuesday. The average voter knows this. Voters will voters like the voters are going to feel smart enough, right? People really want to buy into the narrative that they're smart. They feel really smart, and they think that they are smart enough to do like two crosses on the ballot, right? I just don't buy this point, especially at the point at which Darin tells you that the most vulnerable are the first to stay home. This looks like minorities that need the representation the most. They are the most dependent on the state. Things like state education, healthcare, and welfare programs. Rich people have the money to lobby anyway. This means that they are far less dependent on voting marginally better, right? On our side of the House, minorities even vote in the first place. Even if half of them would turn out, half of the minorities staying home means we have a government that just cares half as much about minority issues because they know that they're not going to actually turn out at the next regional government, which means we have far worse regional policies, right? This is a larger impact. Secondly, a logically prior impact, as Alisa tells you. But thirdly, also, this is an impact on the most vulnerable people in this debate. You should care about this one the most. Then on policy versus accountability. I think there's a low delta on accountability. The branches of the government still check each other. The legislative checks the executive, the judicial branch still checks both, right? They're literally stopping Trump from doing stuff. The media can also check you. The voters can also vote you out next time, right? Because governments want to be re-elected, they want to stay in power. And the opposition doesn't get the same national accountability they claim if you buy that on their side of the house, the media spends so much time on regional and local elections between the elections, then they cannot spend this time on national elections. They can on our side of the house. At least we get national accountability where it matters most because the national government does the most things, right? There aren't any catastrophic policies on government either, as we explained to you, because voters vote you out and courts stop them. But what we get on op is less biased laws, or like on op, we get more biased laws towards the state, even if those are stopped by the courts. Politicians just don't do big reforms because and therefore there's nothing for courts to stop, right? Because they worry about angering people. If there's economic stagnation where reform would be necessary, but because it takes some time to really act, as I've explained to you, as Alisa has explained to you, then politicians just don't do these reforms. Even if opposition gets slightly better accountability on the average policy, you don't even get the attempts for the big reforms that have a high impact. This looks like carbon tax reform to tax the rich, and things that stimulate the economy, which all might, for a couple of months, hurt the government, but in the long term are much, much better. They don't do this or not because they're worried about losing the next regional elections. But these are policies that are really necessarily really good. These literally jumpstart economic growth, which is a far larger impact, helps far more people than marginally better minor policies la-di-da, right? I think in the end, this is a clear win on both relevant clashes for government.
Thank you to the speaker for that speech. Thank you to both teams for that semi-final. We have reached the end of the debate. You will hear from results soon. Thank you.
Thanks for the debate.
Thanks for the round, everyone.
Thank you.
Himan,
Thank you
stop
so much.
recording.